And so you have arrived here, for your inquiring mind has led you to ponder as to the how, when and why regarding belief in a power in the universe, which some call God. Well, it started so long ago that one cannot even measure in years as to when it all came about, but we know that it started as humankind began to wake up. As their eyes opened to the world around them, millions of wonders surrounded them and they were inquisitive as to what they were and what they were doing. It was as if there was a veil between them and the unknown which they sought to explore and peek behind. They followed the animals as they migrated according to the seasons, for the wisdom of earth, sea and air was not quite theirs as yet. Slowly, ever so slowly, the awakening happened until they looked beyond the nature of the land and saw the patterns in the night sky, which led the insects, animals, birds and beasts along routes to keep them safe according to the seasons. They saw themselves as no more, yet no less, than anyone or anything and shared all things equally. With time, the first humans began to gather berries, fruits, meat and fish, and some others studied what they ate and saw how some plants, shrubs, roots and herbs poisoned, killed or cured. They acknowledged that there is a provider, yet more than this, a power that provides for all things, from the fruit on the tree to the rain on the land, from the fish in the sea to the birds in the sky. And the first ones, who awoke acknowledged that all things had spirit, the spirit of the provider. As yet though, they built no homes and lived in the forests, prairies and plains, save for taking refuge in caves as required. The caverns reminded them of the womb from whence they had come, and as a child will kick and push whilst in the womb, likewise, the first awoken ones placed their hands on cave walls. Seeing if the mother-like caves could feel them push, and also showed the cave walls the beasts that were good food and resources for fat and furs, like a child giving its parent a drawing, whilst letting others who came after them know of the animals that could be hunted there. Then the weather began to change, and those awoken ones looked to see where the animals and birds moved to. Following their trail they headed towards different environments and unfamiliar lands. Now, those who studied the stars and nature of which foods were good to eat or harmful, were growing in knowledge and sought to understand the mysterious providing force of the universe. When it came to discussing which way to travel, they would explain their reasoning to their tribes. As the weather continued to change and grow colder, exploration of new areas increased and many migrated north, venturing to these new lands. Some, however, did remain, choosing not to move from what they already knew. As the hunters and gatherers wandered north, their understanding of nature, stars and the weather grew. Those who studied and passed down knowledge became known as those who know. Over the ages, generations upon generations handed down their wisdom, which was built on by the present students. Those who had not moved were also increasing in wisdom, but in a different way, for they learned how to survive as residents in their communities. Thus, a divergence came to pass. This was until the hunter-gatherers began to return with the animals towards the south. Yet in the north, some of the hunters and gatherers chose to remain, for they had become acclimatized and understood the nature of the land. Generations of people remained here, letting the other hunter-gatherers travel south towards more familiar environs. The humans of the north were comfortable here and their learning increased, leading some to explore lands to the northeast and northwest. Those who traveled south had some who chose to remain in certain areas, and as generations came and went, the travelers discovered the new cultures that had arisen since the departure. Those who had remained in the south and learnt about community and staying in the same area had formed wonderful ideas, caring more for their new ways rather than the old. So much so, that vanity had come to them and they looked different from the hunter-gatherers who now returned. As yet, humankind had not baked bread or grown crops, but kept the idea of forest gardens from the older days. Vast areas were allowed to grow species of fauna and flora, including those introduced to the gardens. One forest garden in particular was walled by giant mountains, of which one was an ancient volcano that stood higher than the others. As the hunters and gatherers returned to their homelands, the generation they returned to had trimmed their hair, wore clothing other than mere furs and skins. Looking at their ancestors' descendants, they encouraged them to remain with them, live in the forest garden so they could continue their hunter-gathering ways, yet be a little more civilized. Thus, the modern humans depilated the returnees with clay, used the razor on them, to make them look like themselves, made them suitable clothing and tried to teach them the ways of their culture. The hunter-gatherers entertained these new ideas and struggled with the new ways, as they preferred the freedom of moving, eating what they liked. There were lots of plants, herbs, trees and fruits to eat in the forest gardens, but they were told not to eat the fruit of a particular plant. The ones who knew, amongst the hunter-gatherers, understood why, but getting their brothers and sisters to understand was difficult. Eventually, some of the hunters and gatherers decided to take from the forbidden plant. By doing this, they angered their hosts, for this was the knowledge the hosts tried to impart. There is good and bad, right and wrong. The somewhat egalitarian hunter-gatherers believed that everything was just it is, that events merely happen, yet their hosts insisted that there is a way of things, right-wrong, to ask and not to take. This caused division with the hunters and gatherers, as some understood the way of their hosts, how certain rules were necessary for living in a community, whereas the others believed that everything is freely given and all have equal right to the food granted by the provider. When those who did not understand asked further questions, the hosts explained about a new way of growing food outside of the forest garden, which was called farming. One could plant seeds in the land allotted to them and harvest this for their needs, each having their own share of land. Those who did not agree with their hosts protested further, so much so that disputes, arguments and discussions arose between what was better: cattle or grain, winter or summer, birds or fish being some of them. Another argument that arose was over how to give thanks to the provider, the universe. The hunter-gatherers had one concept and their hosts had a different approach, yet one thing that remained in common was that those who know, on both sides, agreed on how to make the frank offerings of thanks. Those who were already in disagreement with their hosts had formed their own community, creating a division within the hunter-gatherers, so the hosts suggested that when it came to the time when they make their offerings of thanks, each group would give according to how they thought. Thus, the time came to pass and the host culture had their priests make the thankful offering. The hunter-gatherers turned to those who know, in order to make their offering, and those who disagreed with their own kind made their own offering. During the autumn and winter all awaited to see who would have their offerings honored. Spring came and went, as did summer, and when harvest came, the yield of the fields was this. The hosts had plentiful stock gathered, the hunter-gatherers also had a bounty of grain. But those who were in disagreement had not such a plentiful crop. At this, they became enraged and set out to argue and fight. The ruler of the culture explained to them, "We gave the first of our crops, as did the hunter-gatherers, but you who disagreed sorted the crops to judge what was best and what was not." The community of the disagreed became furious with jealousy and made riot. Thus, the ruler of the culture cast them out of the forest garden and they headed eastwards. Hence, those who traveled to the northern Indias were known as the Proto-Indo-Europeans, and those who remained with the culture in Iran became known as Indo-Iranians. The Proto-Indo-Europeans then began to form the Vedic philosophies, and the Indo-Iranians began to increase their understanding of nature and sought to understand the relationship between heaven and earth further. The one thing that the hunter-gatherers in the West had in common with their hosts was to leave the religious activity to those who know, who became known as priests, who continued to study nature, the ways of humans, the relationship between the seen and unseen, God and human. As these ideas developed, the Indo-Europeans in the Indias began constructing buildings to mimic the movements in the heavens. The spiritual ideas of both were similar, but what had occurred in the garden left its impression on the Indo-Europeans, for they believed that events happen and as a result, it will influence one's own karma. Whereas the Indo-Iranians believed there is a battle between good and evil and humans have free will to influence the battle. As generations came and went, those in Persia began to find order within their communities and developed castes according to the abilities of the individuals. People of the castes could mix freely. The castes were presented as agricultural, artisan, soldier, ruler and priestly. At this time the Mok, Magian or Magi, also came to be established. Although they were not specifically classed as priests, they were something more. Together, all these tribes and castes eventually became known as the Medes, the Median Empire of Persia, and they formed an egalitarian confederation, collaborating with and accepting others, and in this way they incorporated external aspects into their ways and customs. In the northern Indias, culture emerged in a similar fashion, yet they decided to not let the castes intermix and develop their own philosophy. However, the Magyans also had permeated into their culture, but the Magyans here were known as Maga. More than this, the Magyans became well known and traveled as far as China in the west and also into northeast of the European continent. The Magyans knew the importance of keeping the fire, air, land and water unpolluted, held knowledge and wisdom, being healers, officiants of ceremonies and astrologers. They also had the ability to peek just beyond the veil, create and sustain fire, interpret dreams and often worked in the administration of rulers. They collated information regarding how to make offerings of thanks, were intermediaries between the state and religion, knew which plants and herbs were good for healing and those that are poisonous, and were able to interpret the seasons by the stars in the heavens. All this information had been born with their ancestors and those who know. Each generation of the Magian learned from their elders and kept the knowledge growing and flowing, keeping the past alive in the present. So it came to pass that the way the Magian perceived had no direct lineage, being attributed to no particular name. Then there came a man, who some say descended from the Magian, and he had an insight into the power of the universe, the provider. Whereas many knew the principles of faith and prayer and attributed gods to represent various needs, such as water and grain, he believed that there was in fact one overall provider, one God, presiding over all things. Those in the Indias also held a similar belief, and that this one provider was at some level within all living things. In the old days, all believed that everything had a soul, a spirit, but this idea now, in the Indias and Persia, had developed to identify these spirits as gods, or God. As they sought to understand the relationship between themselves and God, they asked themselves, where did God come from? What does God do? What does God look like? Answer: ideas formed in their minds of what God, or the gods, looked like, and from this came pictures and sculptures of what the gods, God looked like. The one who had received the insight into these being one God, he explained how there is right and wrong, good and bad, righteousness and sinfulness. He explained this by comparing the wisdom to means already known. Life, he said, was judged upon death. Those who were good and righteous would go to light, and those who were bad would go to darkness. These places eventually became known as heaven and hell. Those in the Indias believe differently though, that life is judged as we live it, and if one does good, good will be returned to them. Equally, if one is bad, bad things come to them. This is known as karma. It is these two ideas that formed the basis of later philosophies and beliefs. The one who had received insight, foretold of others who would come and teach about life, the way of things and how to live a good, righteous life. The Magians recognized him as one their own, yet did not call him a Magian, yet respected the wisdom imparted, for it was in line with what they knew and what had been passed down through the ages. Another who believed in one God also came to be born years later. He came from Ur of the Chaldees, and he traveled to find a land where he could live and share his ideas. As he ventured into Canaan, he faced kingdoms and rulers who both helped and hindered him. This man was met at a high place by two kings, one of which was righteous, whose wisdom was beyond any lineage or being descended of a particular name, and he knew how to make offerings of thanks, and because of this, many believed he was of Magian descent. He went to make offering on behalf of the man from Ur, who then proceeded to establish a land which would later become known as Israel. Generation upon generation gathered in this land, for the man from Ur, who some called Abraham, had sired many tribes, born from his wisdom. Looking to acknowledge their place, the tribes also formed a confederation, like those in Media. The people asked for a king to lead their nation, but God encouraged them to establish a series of judges to guide them in the growth, for God desired people to be like the hunter-gatherers of old, having no settlements and following the seasons and being provided for by the fruits of land and sea. However, humans had now begun to form cities, and thus the concept of owning land came to be. As people began to cultivate land and develop farmsteads, how they perceived the provider, God, also developed. In the days of old, as hunter-gatherers, they acknowledged a provider and understood its unseen, invisible nature, showing itself by the movement in the heavens and the changes in seasons, providing for all their needs. Now though, as cultures continued to develop, civilized cities and nations formed and humans sought to identify the provider. They knew of faith and how it worked, believing that they had already received before asking. But to aid their focus, idols and false gods were formed. Each idol, or god, related to something specific like grain, water or rain, being strong in battle, for example. This was also one of the reasons why the man from Ur traveled away from his homeland to a new place. After the man had sons, they also had families and expanded the boundaries of their land. Now, a question arose in regards in people's minds as to why there is suffering in the world and in the northern Indias. One sought to find an answer to this problem. He considered the issues of aging, illness, evil and other such things that can cause suffering in the world, nay universe as he perceived it. He traveled and practiced contemplation and meditation, learning from different groups of spiritual people. Then, one day, he considered these things very deeply and sought out the answer. And the answer found him, that there is escape from suffering and salvation from the cycle of life and death. He taught these truths to those who would hear and many listened. Those in the Chinese territories began to introduce philosophy to their understanding of the way of things, nature, seasons, weather and continued to study this and introduced some of the Indian man's teachings to their studies. In the Americas, the hunter-gatherers had begun to form ideas of how the Great Spirit worked through nature, and in Australia, they began to imagine the dreaming and how they awoke to consciousness. In the Middle East, the Israelites, Persians, Egyptians and other nations were still searching for how they could escape suffering and began to look to one who could help them. Some their learning had no spread to the Northern Hemisphere, Europe and Scandinavia. The one thing that nearly all of them realized is that the universe is like a tree, and they began to feature in the religious writings. Now, the one who had lived in Persia, of Magian descent, who some call Zoroaster, he had foretold of others who would come after him. The one who had lived in the northern Indias, named as Buddha by many, also told of one who would come after him. In the writings known as the Vedas, they also prophesied of one who would be as the Word and one with the Word that is God. Time passed and one did come, and indeed some called him God with us, the Messiah, the Christ. His name was Yeshua, also known as Joshua and Jesus. When he was born, the Magian visited him and brought gifts which reflected how he would live his life. The Magian were awaiting one named by Zoroaster as the Saushant, one who brings benefit. Jesus brought with him great teachings, salvation from death and suffering, and forgiveness. Yet many who heard him did not listen, and years after his earthly life, his wisdom lived on through many diverse churches. And after him another came who said that God does indeed bring liberation from suffering and there is forgiveness, but they perceived Jesus as prophet, not as God as man. These things formed the many religions of the world, and the belief in a provider came to be known by many names: God, gods, the universe amongst others. Yet faith always remained as it is, the magic of all who truly believe, the hope of things as yet unseen and unknown, that will come to pass. The simple faith of observing the way of things, nature, the seasons, the stars, the weather, acknowledging the provider, remains with us as it did from the hunter-gatherers to modern civilized people. For a long time the knowledge and wisdom was kept by those who know, then the Magian, and then at the heart of the many diverse beliefs. The gift of faith, recognition of a provider, recognizing the way of nature in the seasons and stars, life and death, liberation from suffering, healing and forgiveness, has been passed down through the ages, generation to generation, as a gift to those who have been custodians, entrusted with the wisdom and seek to discover and become closer to the provider. There will come a time when the veil will be lifted, all will see and perceive how things truly are, we will return to being truly egalitarian, and the wisdom of the entrusted will be freely available to all.